Today marks the beginning of a cultural webinar, a new initiative launched by the Media Foundation for West Africa. The webinar aimed at addressing what experts have described as affective polarization in West Africa. Affective polarization makes people in opposing political camps hate each other, unwilling to build consensus, and prioritize loyalty to party over matters of national interest. The webinar seeks to build or is built around dialogues, fact, and narrative to foster a consensus and sustainable solutions to the issue of affective polarization. It seeks to create awareness on affective polarization as a major underlying cause of policy failures and democratic recession in ECOWAS member states. It seeks to mobilize community of depolarization actors to counter the threat at national and regional level and improve media capacity, programming, and reporting on polarization, its effects, and solutions. Ladies and gentlemen, please indulge me as I introduce to you our guest speaker for this webinar. We are privileged to have Professor E. Jimabwedi to present to us on the topic Polarization and Democracy in West Africa. Prof. E. Jimabwedi is a co-founder, chief executive officer, senior advisor, and board chair of Afrobarometer. He is the founder, the former chief executive director of Ghana Center for Democracy and Development, CDD Ghana. He's also an academic and a former professor at the Department of Political Science, University of Ghana, Legon. Prof is also a fellow at American University Center for Democracy, Rule of Law and Development, Woodrow Wilson International Center, U.S. Institute for Peace, International Forum for Democratic Development, and an honor of Martin Luther King Jr. Award for Peace and Social Justice in 2017, and New Africa 10 Most Influential African Leaders in 2021. Please join me to welcome our guest speaker for the webinar, Professor E. Jimabwedi. Prof, please, you may proceed with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Imprem, and thank you, esteemed distinguished colleagues, esteemed guests, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen. It is a privilege to be before you today to reflect on an issue that is not only central to the state of our politics in West Africa, but also critical to the survival of democracy in the region itself, and that is polarization. We begin from a premise that may seem obvious, yet is often overlooked. Polarization is not an anomaly in human society. I repeat, polarization is not an anomaly in human society. It has been with us since the dawn of organized life. Wherever human beings have formed communities, divisions of some kind have existed. Divisions of opinion, interest, identity, and allegiance. And these are as much a part of our social DNA as cooperation and solidarity are. But let us be clear. While polarization may be natural, it is not benign. When opinions, beliefs, or political attitudes in a society move toward extremes and create deep divisions between opposing groups, it can be very corrosive. It can erode trust, fray the bonds of belonging, and create conditions in which collective action becomes almost impossible. And when it metastasizes into political or social hostility, it can break nations apart. It is in this sense that we call polarization abhorrent. If we accept this, then our task as citizens, as policymakers and leaders becomes clear. We must prevent, reduce, and where possible, eradicate the most destructive forms of polarization. And in fact, we should judge the quality of a governance system by its ability to do exactly that. I want us to see first polarization as a pre-existing condition in West African nations and societies. Too often, discussions about West Africa's divisions start with colonialism, as though our societies were once models of unity. This is a comforting but misleading perspective. The truth is that West African societies have always been diverse, often remarkably so. In Nigeria alone, there are supposed to be more than 350 ethnic groups. In Ghana, about 72. In Sierra Leone, Liberia, Senegal, and other nations of the sub-region, the pattern is similar. A West African nation is therefore a mosaic of diverse peoples, languages, faiths, and traditions. Religious diversity in the region is just as striking. Predominantly Christian Ghana and Nigeria are home to large Muslim communities, while in places like Benin, a substantial proportion of the population adheres to traditional religions. And beyond ethnicity and religion, there are many divides of geography and economy, as for instance, between rural and urban communities, between resource-rich and resource-poor regions, between the proletariat, that's the have-nots, and the bourgeoisie, the haves. These differences have long shaped opportunities people can access, the political power they can wield, and the sense of belonging they can claim. For women, youth, ethnic and religious minorities, and many peripheral regions of the same country, the experience has too often been one of exclusion and marginalization. I also want to note that long before colonialism, the land itself shaped our diversity. Geography divided us, the coastal belt from the inland, the forest zones from the savanna, the highlands from the lowlands. These ecological boundaries influenced where people settled, how they lived, and what they valued. Limited transportation and communication technologies in those eras also meant that even communities separated by short distances might live as strangers with distinct languages, customs, and political systems. Then came the colonial powers, and with them, a reshaping, and in many cases, a deepening of these divisions. Boundaries were drawn with more concern for administrative convenience than for cultural coherence. Ethnic groups were divided between countries, while unrelated communities were grouped into a single state. Colonial rule was, of course, experienced unevenly. Some regions saw intensive missionary activity and educational investment, while others were left out as hinterlands with little infrastructure or opportunities. Direct and indirect rule reconfigured traditional authority, creating rivalries between royals and commoners, rulers and subjects, and between age groups. The colonial economy also produced its own forms of division within African territories. Mining towns, plantation zones, and port cities received concentrated investment and infrastructure, becoming highly productive enclaves tied directly to the demands of European and Arab markets. Surrounding rural hinterlands, by contrast, were left undeveloped and served primarily as labor reserves. Their economic role reduced to supplying cheap migratory workers to the enclaves. This spatial arrangement entrenched stark inequalities, reinforcing the notion that some areas were destined to be producers of raw materials. In contrast, others functioned as beneficiaries of whatever limited development the colonial powers deemed profitable. The resulting patterns of uneven development did not end with independence. They laid the foundations for persistent economic imbalances, social stratification, and polarization, as well as dependency in the post-colonial state. However, polarization in many West African states today cannot be understood without tracing its roots to the post-independence political order and the economic trajectories that followed. Independence brought euphoria and a surge of optimism about self-determination. Still, it also ushered in profound and persistent challenges. Many of the governance models adopted in the early decades after colonial rule replicated or even worsened pre-existing privileges, substituting one form of elite dominance for another. Authoritarian rulers of West Africa often anchored their legitimacy in narrow ethnic, regional, or patronage networks, monopolizing political and economic power and entrenching systems of exclusion. Centralized political structures concentrated decision-making in national capitals, denying grassroots communities meaningful participation and marginalizing minorities from influence over public affairs. Deep-seated cultural hierarchies, such as gerontocracy, male dominance, and deference to elite authority, went largely unchallenged, keeping youth, women, and other underrepresented and marginalized groups on the periphery of political and economic life. From the late 1970s through the 1990s, successive economic downturns, mounting debt burdens, and the structural adjustment programs of the Bretton Woods institutions further constrained state capacity to deliver services and distribute resources equitably. In many West African nations, the austerity measures entailed in the structural adjustment programs dismantled local safety nets, widened inequality, and eroded trust in public institutions. Indeed, rapid urbanization, the rise of digital technologies, and the shifting global power dynamics have significantly altered the political landscape in West African nations in recent years. Yet, the centralization of power, elite capture of resources, and the zero-sum competition for state control continue to shape political life in our countries. These structural conditions have not only entrenched inequality, but also intensified polarization. Exclusionary governance and economic marginalization reinforce identity-based divisions. They deepen mistrust between groups and erode any shared sense of national purpose. The result is a political arena where citizens increasingly view their rivals not as legitimate opponents, but as existential threats, and where disputes over policy or resources quickly take on ethnic, regional, or generational overtones. The wave of democratization that swept across West Africa in the 1990s had been greeted with optimism. It was widely viewed as an opportunity to replace decades of authoritarian and military rule with more participatory and accountable governance. New constitutions promised equality before the law, outlawed discrimination, and enshrined broad civil and political rights. Electoral systems were consciously designed to promote inclusion and to manage diversity. Example is Nigeria's informal arrangement known as the zoning or rotation principle, which is internal to the political parties, especially the dominant People's Democratic Party, PDP, and to some extent the All Progressive Congress, the APC. The design was for them to rotate the presidency among the regions and to ensure minimum support across states was intended to prevent domination by any single ethnic bloc. In the case of Ghana, the ban on ethnic or religious-based parties sought to avert the politicization of identity, incorporated extensive constitutional safeguards for minorities, and then proportional representation to avoid marginalization of smaller groups. West Africa's new era of democratization also empowered civil societies. It strategically connected them to formal mechanisms of governance, which helped to transform governance from a technical institutional exercise into a lived practice of inclusion. Where and in situations where civil society actors were active and supported, they have helped to reduce polarization by ensuring that citizens experience some level of fairness in governance. They've created space for shared civic identities beyond identity-based divisions. The democratization era has also enabled the emergence of youth-led grassroots civic organizations to challenge entrenched systems of exclusion and oppression, harnessing social media and transnational networks to demand inclusion and transparency as well as justice. Manifestations of these movements, these youth and feminist movements and coalitions and grassroots civic organizations, some of the actions have been seen in the NSAS in Nigeria, the youth-led Jolobi protests that took place against the Akufo-Addo government's corruption a few years ago. The Free Senegal protests against corruption and constitutional manipulation after the arrest of Ousmane Sonko, and the Burkinabe uprising, La Bataille Citoyenne, that ousted Blaise Compaoré, and also Guinea's mass mobilizations against Alpha Conde's third-term bid in 2019-2020, and the M5 RFP coalition in Mali. I cite these as examples of what the democratization era has enabled ordinary citizens and citizen groups to do to challenge systems of exclusion and dictatorship and to demand inclusion, transparency, and justice. Unfortunately, democratic politics in West African nations have not always lived up to their promise of delivering adequate social cohesion, political or economic inclusion. even more concerning, in some cases, democratic politics has contributed to increased polarization. Indeed, multi-party elections have exacerbated social tensions and increased fragility in some West African nations. For example, a deadly civil conflict was sparked in the Ivory Coast when Konan Bedie and his cronies invented the idea of Ivoirité and the so-called Article 35 to bar opponents from contesting in the polls. And severe instability did follow the multi-party, the transition polls, which was multi-party based in Sierra Leone, in Togo, and perhaps even in Nigeria. So, and it's also the case that polarization has deepened in some West African countries in the democratic era. Notably, in a country like Togo, polarization has intensified because of the problem of perpetual incumbency of the Eyadema dynasty, because of the lack of power alternation, because of the entrenched ruling party dominance, because of gross abuse of power, and because of the manipulation of the constitution to extend presidential tenure. And you see versions of this, varieties of this, levels of this across West African polities. And it's been so much that even some national reconciliation projects and transitional justice programs, such as those inspired by the South African Truth Commission and other post-regime accountability measures, have been perceived as a form of political vendetta and witch hunting of opponents, and have helped to deepen rather than address the problem of political exclusion. And of course, thanks in part to relative inexperience with liberal democratic practices, consensus over the basic rules of democratic competition tends to be weak in West African democracies. Winner-takes-all approaches and the crude application of the principles of democratic rule tend to characterize our politics. In general, there's been a tendency for parties in this era to form along ethnic and other sectarian lines, despite constitutional and legal provisions against such actions and such formations. And for candidates to mobilize voters along these sectarian lines, and for voting to follow pronounced ethnic patterns in some of our countries. And reflecting their inability to articulate convincing policies and programs, and also the issueless nature of our election campaigns, there has been a tendency for parties and candidates vying for political power in multi-party elections to emphasize personalities. And of course, once you emphasize personalities, you amplify home region and hometown attributes rather than national attributes. Also, opposition parties in our region tend to assume a high-strung posture against the government, partly in reaction to how governments also hog power and abuse power. Relations between ruling and opposition parties tend to be characterized by mutual loathing, partly reflecting the residual bitterness over past political oppression. In addition to weak administrative capacity, West African election management authorities and judiciaries often lack adequate independence, which undermines their trustworthiness and legitimacy. The actions, inactions, decisions, and indecisions of our election management bodies and the courts have tended to favor the incumbent president and party, and often at the expense of the opposition. The inability of our election management bodies and our courts to resolve election disputes speedily and fairly promotes do-or-die attitudes among poll contestants, creating an incentive for parties and candidates to focus on being declared winners by hook or crook and to use their control over state power and incumbency to ward off post-election challenges. And I'll come to the case of the media, your constituency as Media Foundation for West Africa. Thanks mainly to inadequate training and weak professionalism, journalists may engage in thoughtless sensationalism and promote ethnic, sectarian, and other partisan agendas, which threaten the integrity of the democratic process in their countries and overall stability within their nations. And at the same time, regulatory frameworks remain, that's media regulatory frameworks, remain largely predatory or ineffective. And while, as I noted earlier, civil society mobilizations have helped to bridge some of the divisions, they have at least sometimes also provoked state repression and backlash politics, further intensifying the cycle of polarization. I want us now to look at empirical data to determine whether West African nations are getting more ethnically polarized in the era of multi-party democracy. I pose this as a question and that we try to answer below. So we ask the question, what does nationally representative survey data tell us about polarization in West Africa today? The answer, as revealed in the latest round of Afrobarometer, that's the round 10 survey, conducted between 2024 and 2025, offers a nuanced story. It's a story that challenges simplistic assumptions about polarization and a multi-party democracy in West Africa. When citizens are asked whether they see themselves primarily in ethnic or national terms, the most common answer across West Africa is strikingly balanced. Half say they identify equally with both. In Ghana, for example, more than 2/3 of the population identifies itself in this dual space. They say they feel equally Ghanaian and Akan, or say equally Ghanaian and Ewe. While in Liberia, the proportion is even higher. In fact, only a small minority in any West African country claims to feel only or more, that is exclusively more ethnic than national. This suggests that even amid diversity and political competition, a shared sense of nationhood remains resilient across West Africa. I must note that because the Afrobarometer was not able to ask these questions in some West African countries for security and political sensitivity reasons, we are able to share data for only 8 to 9 West African countries in this round. And that's why what you see in the slides that are being projected. It's also the case that identity alone does not capture the lived experience of West Africans. When respondents were asked if their ethnic group is ever maltreated by the government, more than 4 in 10 West Africans say this happens at least sometimes. In Nigeria, nearly half of our respondents report such discrimination, report experiencing such discrimination frequently or occasionally. And in countries like Guinea and Ghana, close to a third share this concern. The pattern is consistent, even where citizens hold strong national identities, perceptions of bias and exclusion remain widespread. This is a reminder that belonging is not just about symbols, but it is also about fairness in practice. Partisanship, political partisanship, adds another layer. Across the sub-region, most citizens say they do not feel close to any political party. In Mali, more than 80% of the population distances itself from party identification, while in Ghana and Nigeria, majorities, but not as high as Mali, also fall outside the partisan loyalty. And among those who identify with parties, the overlap with ethnic identity is notable. Citizens who see themselves as more or only ethnic are only slightly more likely to affiliate with a party than those who lean towards national identity. This means that ethnicity and partisanship intersect, but not in the deterministic way that some of us tend to assume. What emerges from these Afrobarometer findings is neither a tale of deepening ethnic fault lines or a romantic narrative of harmony. Instead, it is a story of tension and complexity, and that citizens hold on to both ethnic and national identities, yet remain alert to discrimination. They distrust parties, yet political competition often reactivates old divisions. Multi-party democracy, therefore, has not eradicated polarization, but neither has it condemned West Africa to ethnic fragmentation. And I want to repeat, multi-party democracy has not eradicated polarization, but neither has it condemned West Africa to ethnic fragmentation. Now, how do we chart a path forward to depolarization? My answer is, and so I'll spend the remaining part of the presentation talking about ways in which there is hope, ways in which we should be able to solve, to address this problem of polarization within the democratic context. After all, Afrobarometer data have consistently shown that despite frustrations with governance, West Africans remain deeply committed to democracy and reject non-democratic alternative forms of government. In the latest Afrobarometer surveys, again, the round 10, conducted between 2024 and 2025, 2/3 of respondents across 35 countries indicated that democracy is preferable to any other kind of government. A similar percentage, 66.7%, indicated that they strongly disapprove of military rule. The implication is that to align with the wishes of the average citizen, democratic principles and practices must be incorporated into the governance structures of West African nations. In other words, we are not free if we want to follow the wishes of West African citizens. We are not free to say that we are finding democratic practices too difficult, so we are dropping it. Because if we do so, will be doing so against the wishes of a clear majority of our citizens. Fortunately, there is no shortage of innovative, democracy-consistent approaches to governance in West African nations that point the way forward. Some of them are rooted in local traditions, while others have been adapted from comparative experiences and global best practices. This includes strengthening local governance through genuine devolution of political, administrative, and fiscal powers. Doing this can bring decision-making closer to citizens, diffuse tensions that often arise when distant central governments are perceived as unresponsive or biased. Of course, the large and diverse West African states can explore federal or quasi-federal arrangements as in the Nigerian federal system and try to grant meaningful autonomy while safeguarding national unity. We should also look to power sharing agreements, especially when such agreements are designed to avoid gridlock, because they can ensure that no single group monopolizes authority. At the same time, minority protections must be embedded not only in the constitutional text, but also in everyday political practice, and must be reinforced and enforced through accessible courts, independent human rights bodies, and vigilant civil society monitoring. It would also require re-engineering political parties to build broad cross-ethnic coalitions by, for instance, linking public financing or electoral incentives to demonstrated diversity in leadership and voter outreach. We must also look to fair resource distribution, particularly when constitutionally grounded, because that way material resources, infrastructure, services, jobs, and symbolic resources, recognition, representation, national awards, and so on, can be done and structured in such a way that they affirm every citizen's place in the national project. It also calls for justice systems to emphasize restorative approaches over retributive ones, and to provide opportunities for reconciliation in post-conflict settings and address historical wrongs without perpetuating cycles of revenge. And nationally, citizenship laws can be reformed to reflect the region's complex histories of migration, kinship, and interdependence, rather than narrow exclusionary criteria that often deepen insider-outsider divides. And economic policy too must do more to grow GDP, must ensure that the benefits of growth are widely shared using targeted social protection, regional investment equity, and fair access to markets to narrow the structural inequalities that fuel polarization. And civic education in schools, community spaces, and through the media can be used to foster a culture of citizenship rooted in empathy, mutual respect, and a commitment to the common good. Above all, the continent and our region can draw on its own democratic traditions. The Gotla of Botswana, for instance, where open community assemblies deliberate until consensus is reached, or the Palava Tree of West Africa, where disputes are resolved through inclusive dialogue, or the ideals of the Akan Edinkra Nkronti ni Akwemu symbol, which captures constitutional checks and balances as a central element of the Akan traditional political system. Or Liberia's institution of the national orator, which provides a platform for a designated individual to speak freely and openly about the nation's triumphs and deficiencies on an annual basis. Or the Fambu Talk in Sierra Leone, where community reconciliation unfolds around truth-telling bonfire circles. And other indigenous forums that value reconciliation over domination and the importance of speaking truth to power. These are not abstract ideals, but living practices that, if revitalized and scaled, can provide culturally resonant pathways out of polarization and toward a more cohesive and inclusive future. My concluding remarks. Polarization may be an old companion of human society, woven into our histories of power, identity, and belonging, but it need not dictate our future. West Africa's ethnic, linguistic, and religious diversity is a source of richness, a mosaic of cultures, histories, and worldviews, and not a curse. But diversity becomes a strength only when it is nurtured through inclusive governance and shared sense of national purpose. Democracy offers the tools to achieve this balance: constitutions that protect rights, electoral systems that reward coalition building, independent institutions that check abuse, and civic spaces where dialogue can replace confrontation. Yet, these tools work only if we commit to designing and using them with inclusion, fairness, and mutual respect at their core. The challenge before us, therefore, is not simply to preserve democracy as a label or as a ritual of periodic multi-party elections, but to make it meaningful in the daily lives of our citizens, to ensure that democracy is felt in fair access to opportunity, in equal protection under the law, in leaders who serve rather than rule. True democracy should be a force that unites rather than divides, a force that heals the wounds of history rather than deepens them, and a force that transforms our remarkable diversity into our greatest strength. We can do this. If we can do this, West Africa will not only secure its democratic gains, but also eliminate a path for others, a living example that diversity, when managed with vision and humility, can be the engine of resilience, creativity, and shared prosperity. We can demonstrate to the world that polarization, rather than being a terminal condition, can be reframed as a starting point for building bridges, forging common ground, and envisioning a shared future. Thank you very much for your attention, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Professor Jima Bwedi. I describe him as the father of modern democracy in Africa. Prof, thank you for your eloquence. Thank you for painting the picture from cultural, from historical perspective, from post-independence and the current era that we have and confronted with the challenge of polarization. But it gives us hope that we can overcome this challenge. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us thus far. I want to remind you that interpretation section is still available. You can switch to English, French, or Portuguese. We also reminded that you can leave your comments, questions, contribution in the chat box, and we'll respond to that. We also want to let you know that the slides, the paper will be shared with you after we'll publish it, and you can find it on our website and our most social media handles. We're going to take a 5-minute health break, very important, so that we can resume at the sections that Prof will take and respond to all your questions, all your concerns that you may have regarding this webinar. So we'll see you in the next 5 minutes. Thank you.
because we know that there is a problem. And we are here also because we know collectively we can brainstorm, build synergy, and act together to counter the threat posed by hate speech, mis- and disinformation, and polarization.
Let me invite churches. Let me invite mosques. Let me invite my brother Numos people, the African traditional religion believers. Let me invite our revered traditional rulers, religious leaders. Let me invite the youth of this country. The Ghana Police Service, I'm inviting you. I'm inviting every Ghanaian, the businessmen of this country, I'm inviting you. We have a duty to ensure we keep our country safe.
On the other issue about the platform management, I think we need to learn from what Kenya and South Africa did recently. They put together a big coalition that had civil society, regulators, everybody, and then they got the platforms into it. So what happened was that anytime you came across content that all of us agreed was problematic, it was easy to deal with the platforms to say, this has to be taken down. I have the honor and the privilege to declare the coalition that has just been presented before you duly launched. Thank you so much.
And unfortunately, or fortunately, I dare say it's almost impossible to set up a radio station if you don't have political clout. It's almost impossible. I mean, you check the profile of the owners of the various radio stations we have across the country. It's almost impossible to be just a normal individual to set up, put a group together and raise money, get equipment, and set up a radio station. It's almost impossible.
So PNC gives their support, and as you've mentioned, we are supporting the coalition to fight hate speech in the country.
The CPP is for peace. We support the coalition for peace.
It goes without saying that when you leave people without the necessary guidance, they might say things or do things that might be detrimental to they themselves and to the society in which they are. That is why we need to commend Media Foundation for West Africa, the National Peace Council, and the relevant stakeholders for continuously drawing our minds to the fact that we have people amongst us who may be doing things the wrong way.
I think that this is a laudable discussion that you've had so far. I think that moving forward, we should have some more where we can engage the stakeholders on hate speech and polarizing the airwaves.
This has been a very useful initiative. It's a fantastic program. Maybe I should even suggest that they should, if it's possible, to go to every media house in the spectrum and have an in-house engagement with them. It will be really, really good.
Events like this are reminders for us to toe the right line for the democracy that we have all been hoping and yearning for.
I think that there's more we should be talking about, and sometimes because of time constraints, we are not able to. So this is a discussion that should be regular.
Thank you so much for staying with us. We encourage you that continue to fill the pre-evaluation form to let us know your expectation for this webinar. Also, we're encouraging you as much as possible, if you can, to type your question your comment, contribution in the chat box. And soon, Prof will respond to those questions. We've been joined on a webinar by representatives from ECOWAS. We have academia, we have founders, we have the heads of civil society organizations, media managers, peace building actors, founders, development partners, political parties, youth, students, women's group across West Africa and beyond. Also, we have our executive director joining us for this webinar. Soon, we are going to the Q&A sessions. And Prof, there is a question for you, and you may want to respond to them one after the other. The first question that we have here, just to remind you that polarization often weakens civic trust and make democracy or democratic polarization more fragile. From your perspective, what practical strategies have you proven effective in West Africa to expand the civic space, especially for youth, women who are navigating politically polarized environment? That's the first question. Unfortunately, we don't have a name to the questionnaire, but you can speak to the person who asked that question. Prof.
No, the question has too many moving parts.
Definitely.
So I want to be a bit clear about what the question is that I must answer.
Essentially, he's seeking your perspective on what practical strategies have proven effective in dealing with civic space, dealing with the issue of youth and women participation in governance.
I'm afraid I still don't get it.
Yes,
and I call on anybody also to help. I mean, that it's not, I don't specialize in this, so I can also be educated. And especially those of you who are in the activism, civic activism space may have better ideas about how to, again, as I said, the question is a bit too broad.
Right. So, Prof, we'll come back to that. We are trying to get to the person who asked the question to make it more clarity for you. But in the meantime, there's also another question.
So just restate it. Let's see if it can even be broken down.
Right. He says polarization often weakens civic trust and makes democratic participation more fragile.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that is true. So
from your perspective, what practical strategies have proven effective in West Africa to expand civic space, especially for youth and women who are navigating politically polarized environments?
Okay.
That's a question.
Yeah. I mean, this is something that constitution writers and designers will huddle over in months to try and crack for any country. But I mean, in general, it seems to me that when you in the course of promoting participation, there has to be some ground rules, there has to be some parameters. So participation doesn't mean disorder. I think we've got situations in our country, for instance, where sometimes participation means that I can think more about the media, that freedom of speech, freedom of expression, media protection can also be turned into cacophony. It can be turned into a culture of noise. It can turn into irresponsible behavior. So I think we should be seeking answers to how to promote any political good, such as media freedom or civic participation without turning it into anarchy. Because when it turns to when it turns anarchical, it always invites state intervention, state repression, and I spoke earlier on about some of the predatory measures that governments have adopted to deal with a media that they find too assertive. So it is really, how do we find a sweet spot between state control and self-control, state regulation and self-regulation? And if it's participation, but participation is breeding polarization, what do we do to curb it? And one of the ways that is being kept, for instance, is to put parameters around participation. So everybody can form a party, but you are not free to form a party that is ethnic or religious. That's some of the ways in which this particular challenge, the challenge of participation in partisan politics, freedom to form and join parties, have been constrained by law specifically to prevent polarization and division. So you rule out ethnic-based parties, you rule out religious-based parties. I'm sure we want to do the same thing with, say, broadcasting. In the case of broadcasting, I heard some of the information shared in your promo. The fact that, if you're going to, how do you prevent polarization in the name of free speech and free expression, when in fact you have radio stations and TV stations that are politically affiliated, actually not affiliated, owned by politically exposed persons. So there are ways in which we take democratic freedoms to absurd levels, but it's also because we don't regulate well. And so my answer to the question the person posed is that, yes, you want to promote participation in the name of democracy. You want to promote inclusion in the name of democracy, but you should also be careful not to overdo it, and that you regulate credibly, and you enforce the laws in a fair and impartial manner, and doing so, you can curb the negative side effects of some of these political goods that we all pursue.
Thank you, Prof, for responding.
So whoever asked that question, I hope there are some answers within the many things I've said, but I'm happy to have help from many of you in the audience to address these kinds of questions.
Right. Thank you, Prof. Prof is encouraging those of us on the platform. If you have also some suggestions, you can add your voice to that question. Prof, there's a related question on the issue of winner takes all. This is coming from Naomi Afriye Inyano, and he says, please, how can we move away from the winner takes all attitude often adopted by political leaders in power in order to reduce its negative effect on democracy in West Africa? I can repeat the question.
I heard this.
Right. Thank you, Prof.
I think, yeah, it's clear and straightforward enough a question. Well, as we all know, we've been concerned about winner takes all attitudes and practices in our politics for a long time. As a comedian once said, everybody complains about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. Everybody complains about winner takes all, but nobody does anything about it. We if we continue to reward our politicians and governments and political actors who engage in winner-takes-all behaviors by voting for them, then of course they will continue to do so. But I think very often the winner-takes-all attitude and practices do happen because the winners can take it all, because we enable them, because there's an opportunity to do so, and there's no penalty at all for doing so. And in fact, you are almost penalized for not playing winner-takes-all politics. So when when there is an electoral turnover, when there is a change of party in government, and there is general expectation that whoever was had been laid off in the previous administration can just go and take back their jobs, or that whoever holds school feeding contracts must hand over to the new guys. So of course, then we are basically indicating acceptance of winner takes all. So that's one. There's also that winner takes all because they can, because we are able to, because we allow them to, because we don't discourage them from doing so, because we do not punish them from doing so, we do not prevent them from doing so. And if we are not, then I think what we deserve what we get is essentially my answer to that question. If we don't want it, if we don't want winner takes all, we should not reward those who conduct themselves in that manner. We shouldn't praise them. And maybe it will just to see how complicit we all are in this. In one round of Afrobarometer, maybe 2014 or 2016, we asked a question about whether parties reward their foot soldiers with government positions and jobs and others. And a clear majority of Ghanaians said yes. So that response alone suggests to me that we are not always very sure. So we are upset with winner takes all when the winner is there on the other side. But we are okay with it when the winner is us or on our side. So if we want to do something about it, we have to all adopt a straight, fairness and justice approach to it. Do we accept it when politicians take public resources and hand them as rewards to their followers and supporters or not? If we don't support it, how do we make our voices heard? How do we act against that? And then maybe if there is loud enough a chorus, pass legislation, enact laws, maybe change the constitution to make it difficult for the winner to take all.
Thank you, Prof, for your response. Momo, I hope I got the name right, from Sierra Leone, is encouraging us and congratulating us for this webinar, the first edition. From Haruna, he asks, Prof, how can border dispute be diffused and inclusivity promoted in West Africa, where many people identify more strongly with ethnic group than with national citizenship?
Well, I hope Mr. Haruna listened to my presentation carefully, because I said actually there is no country in the average West African country, what you get is that citizens relate equally to their ethnicity and to the nation. And that's actually not bad. The part of them says, yeah, so I'm an Akan, and so I'm an Akan. You can't change that. But also at the same time, it doesn't prevent them from relating to the nation. If the burden of everything I've tried to convey is that we should, therefore, if we want more, one, you don't want to suppress ethnicity, and because if you do, you are basically attacking nature. But you also want to reward cooperation. You want to reward collaboration. You want to reward coalition. You want to reward those actions that promote national unity. And that is what you do when you say, well, we allow you to form a political party, but we will not register that party if it is an ethnic party or a religious party. We allow you to speak your language and practice your culture. But I mean, if you are going to now stand on that and attack other religions and other ethnic groups, where the law will not permit that. So it's the kinds of incentives and disincentives we put in place that will guide people towards being more national than ethnic. If we don't put in the right incentives, we don't have the right structures, and people go according to their instincts and nature, maybe they will choose to be more ethnic and do and act on that basis. But we design systems, and West Africa has many examples of systems that have been designed to discourage sectarianism and division.
Thank you, Prof. We still have a couple of questions. This one, I'm sure, because you've invited others to share their perspective. Probably I'm aware Mr. Suleiman Ibrahima and Mr. Josapa are on the call. It's more related to the media. Kobina Dakon Asari is asking how can the media be controlled and regulated well. Prof, maybe you can add your voice. But before they come in, there's a question from Abigail Akofa Adasia. She says, how can electoral reforms such as changes to the voting system or campaign financing and regulation help to reduce polarization?
Yes, electoral reform and how it can be designed to curb polarization. Well, political science has some tools here, a whole mix of tools. One of them is going past the post system, for instance, so that going for versions of proportional representation, list systems, and the like. The only caution I give is that we should also look at the examples, what happens in those countries in West Africa that have proportional representation, for instance, versus, say, Ghana's experience. I mean, typically, when you have proportional representation, it has a tendency to separate the representative from the citizen, from the voter, because you don't quite control or determine who you vote for. You cast your vote, and then a list is prepared, and then maybe somebody there's always a trade-off between first past the post system like we have here, and then the system of proportional representation that prevails, especially in Francophone West African countries. You also notice that in the Francophone West African countries, parliament tends to be a bit weaker than the Ghanaian. If we think the Ghana one is weak, the Francophone country parliaments tend to be even weaker. So there are trade-offs in these kinds of situations. The last thing you want is for some party bosses to go and sit in a small room and then decide that, well, these are the names that we are giving you for your representatives based on the vote, because basically you give power in a proportional representation, you give power partly to the voter, but they share them with party bosses. And I can tell you, I mean, I'm sure I won't mention anybody's name, but there are a whole lot of party bosses in your countries and my country that the last thing you want is to have them be deciding who should represent you. Because when they get a chance to choose the same people who choose all kinds of incompetent people for appointment to important state boards and state companies and so on, are the ones who are going to choose your representatives for you. Well, you think about it. So yes, there are ways of reforming electoral system so that they promote unity rather than division. And definitely the proportional representation from the list system and rank voting and so on have come recommended. And we may want to consider some of them.
Thank you, Prof. Mr. Sulemana, do you want to take the question on the media regulation? Or Mr. Joseph on Esquire? Okay, we'll get
hold on, Kojo. Let me promote Sule to.
Okay, so once you come on board,
I've done that. Okay.
Prof can go ahead. Okay, so Prof, there's a question that is coming from Aurelia AEC. She is thanking you for your insightful presentation. And then she asks, what, Prof, gives you hope about democracy, or what gives you hope about the future of democracy in West Africa, despite the current levels of polarization?
What gives me hope? Probably it's also the lack of, I can't see an alternative to democracy. Maybe I am short-sighted, but it's very difficult for me to see a credible alternative to democracy and to democratic politics for any society anywhere. If you think a situation in which you have no choice in who governs you, you have no choice whether to remove them or to keep them if you think they are misgoverning, in which a situation in which your rights are what your leader allows you, a situation in which you are not able to say that I don't like this government policy, it should be changed, or I like this government policy, it should be kept. And if you are unlucky and your leaders are mean and nasty, you have to live with it. You only have to count on your luck that you have good leaders, you have sensible leaders, you have leaders who are fair and equitable and will treat you as such. But that is basically giving up your agency as a human being. So for me, for all these reasons, I don't see an alternative to democracy, at least as an idea, and also with many of its practices that I'm familiar with.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you, participant, for bringing.
So for that alone, I would say it's difficult, but we just have to keep pushing and trying to make it better, but not to abandon.
Right. Thank you, Prof, for being optimistic about the future of democracy in West Africa. Thank you, Ford Foundation, for joining the panel. This is coming from Omar of Ford Foundation, and he has two barra questions for you, Prof. The first one is that what is the link between polarization and a recent military invasion of power in the region? And I guess it's referring to the Sahel Belt. And two, how do we analyze the impact of social media and global influence on democracy in West Africa?
Can you repeat the second question?
Second one is, how do we analyze the impact of social media and global influence on democracy in West Africa?
No, first, the link between polarization and the military takeovers. I don't know. I don't think, from what I read, from what I know, the military takeovers have not been triggered by excessive polarization. I mean, if you take Niger, for instance, the record suggests that the deposed president was doing quite a bit to mitigate the ethnic polarization of that society, but it didn't stop. It didn't stop the coup from occurring. So I don't know if polarization per se was a factor in the coups. I think, if anything at all, what we know is clearly that it's the ineffectiveness of the incumbent elected governments in the Central Sahelian countries in addressing and curbing insurgency and the takeover of national lands, national territory was a big part of it. Corruption on the part of the elected leaders was part of it, but I haven't heard of polarization as a big reason for it, because if polarization were to determine a military takeover, probably would happen in the other, there are some better candidates in West Africa than the ones in the Sahel that got overtaken by.
Right.
I think there was a bit of political polarization based on Conde's ill-fated and ill-advised third-term limit extensions.
Thank you so much for the response. There are more questions in the Q&A section.
But I wanted to look at the question about the impact of social media and global influences on polarization in West Africa. And again, on the impact of social media, the extent to which the social media is intensifying feelings of polarization and so on. I think you folks at the Media Foundation for West Africa are in a far better position to answer this question than I can. But I imagine that, given the nature of social media, given the way in which the faceless nature of some of the interactions and the way in which it seems to give vent, give people the opportunity and the space to spew out all kinds of things, I can see it as a factor of deepening division, making groups and people feel worse about themselves, feel hated and despised and so on. And I'm not sure, I'm a layperson in this area, but I'm not sure we have found a handle on this yet.
Thank you, Prof.
And so we should peg it as a problem that we should be tackling if we want to enjoy whatever benefits there are to social media, but also to not let us overwhelm us and to destroy us.
Thank you, Prof. Your layman view is well noted. And there's a related question coming from Mr. Suleiman Ibrahima, still in the space of misdisinformation and social media. And he's saying misdisinformation have often been cited as a major fomenters of toxic polarization. Some have advocated laws to be enacted against disinformation. Others say legislation will ultimately hinder free speech and expression. What is your view on this?
Oh, I mean, why is he asking me a question that I should be asking him? So really, I'm curious to. I'll be very interested. I'm very much interested in having an answer to that question from somebody who knows a lot more about this than I will ever know. So Sule, please help me out. What should we do?
Sule, back to you now. What is your view on the question that you asked? And also, there's a question on media regulation, if you can tie the two together.
No, so since George is the principal regulator and he's a lawyer, maybe I would defer both questions to George Sapong. The bit about analyzing civil society, analyzing social media and its implications for democracy in the region, and this bit about whether or not we should legislate against mis and disinformation. So, George, if you can take it up.
The challenge is that I'm not seeing Mr. George Sapon in the attendees. Maybe he's left. But what name did you spot him with? Is it the same George Sapon?
Yes, but I think maybe because he said later he may attend another event. Maybe he's no longer on the platform.
Oh, okay. All right, that's fine.
Okay. Maybe we'll still leave that question at the back burner and then interrogate a bit further. But in the meantime, this coming from Dr. Tieta, who is a fellow here and also a lecturer at the Department of Communication Studies, Legon. He said, might the challenge of polarization in West Africa not be partly due to the fact that we have transposed a Western culture and ideologically understanding of democracy, where individualism and differences are celebrated, onto a collectivist social and cultural context, where commonwealth and belongingness are expected, with the effect that all it seems to take is for the shredded politicians to tap into the us versus them identity that draw numbers. Should we consider or reconsider our understanding of democracy? This is really coming from an academic. So, Prof, over to you.
So, but there are a lot of false assumptions in the question. First false assumption is the idea that some societies are individualistic and others are communal. You know, societies evolve. In the kind of society in which I grew up in a village, I knew the name of every household from one end of the village to the other. I knew who they were related to. All my peers, I knew who their parents were, who their grandparents were, what kind of church, or they were Christian, Muslims, they were Christian, what church they attended. I knew a whole lot about them. We spoke the same language and so on. So under those circumstances, it's easy to be communal. I moved to Accra. I don't necessarily know. I know maybe I may know my next door neighbors, my immediate next door neighbor, but not the others. There are some ways in which questions and propositions like that are woefully nostalgic and are talking about a world that stopped existing a long time ago. And that most complex societies find ways of building solidarity, not on the basis of a presumption that everybody is a nationalist, everybody is a patriot, everybody is peace-loving, everybody is God-fearing, and so on. Once you begin to sort of give attributes to people based on what used to be long ago and not what prevails in reality, you are already heading in the wrong direction. So, my dear brother, Dr. Theater, my suggestion to you is that at least the world that I see and in which I live today, I don't know if I can say the average Ghanaian is communal and fraternal and brotherly, or they are individualistic. So that's one. Two, the thing about, and there's also, as a political scientist, there's also something that comes to mind. In those times, when then your ruler will be a chief. The chief will be somebody who comes from your ancestral line, somebody who you belong to the same clan, the same ethnic group, and so on. So, and you worship the same God. You pray to the same God. You use the same God to invoke curses. Now that Antoine Yaman's curses can be countermanded by Professor Kumchacha's Prophet Kumchacha's curses, you are talking about a completely different Ghanaian society, too diverse, and that whenever you have diversity, you have this sort of social, economic, ethnic, cultural diversity, you are not going to resort to some cultural rule to whose culture are you even going to adopt to draw your rule book from. So I just think we live in the kind of world we live in does not allow anybody to make a categorical statement about Africans being communalistic and some other people being individualistic. We are actually both at best, and some probably more individualistic than some people in Ghana, being more individualistic and therefore more selfish than you can find in other parts of the world. So let's think of, so forget, even if you want to forget about democracy, let's ask, how do you, if you want somebody to govern you in a society like ours, if you want to choose political leaders, if you are not going to do elections, how else would you do it? Pray or have some shaman, some okonfo come and conjure a stool that is given to one man to sit on and rule? I mean, when we are making a proposal like that, we should also question, what is the alternative? Instead of saying that because we are this way, we are not individualistic. Democracy is from individualistic cultures and for individualistic individuals and the like. I don't think it's a good way to go. So, Dr. Theater, my challenge to you is, given that we are not as communal as you think, find me a non-democratic alternative, and I'll be happy to take it.
Thank you, Prof. Indulge us, you may have to respond to a few more questions. We are flooded with so many questions in the Q&A section. So I'll take you back to the Department of Political Science, where we have Dr.
Hold on, there's somebody who has a question for Mr. Huede in the chat box.
Okay.
What can be done to reduce social disparities between rural and urban populations in the area of public policy?
Yeah, Prof, you want to respond to that before I come in with the other question?
No, I mean, I find it interesting. It's an interesting question to ask. I don't necessarily have an answer, but I think in my submissions, I did say that equitable sharing of equitable distribution of national resources is important. And so an economic system and economic policies that over-reward urban dwellers and under rewards and punishes rural populations is a problem. It's problematic. You know, the fact that just about everything you do in Ghana may make you more money than the one who grows food for you to eat is a problem that needs to be addressed. And so when there is tension between the urban and the rural populations, and then people find rural life impossible to live, so then they move, they migrate, and then congestion is created, and all kinds of urban problems are created. That is a society where polarization is likely to increase rather than decrease. So I think it's a good question. I think implicit in the question is a solution. We must reduce the economic and social disparities between our urban and rural areas. It shouldn't be that as soon as you move a little bit away from the city center of Accra, you enter into this huge peri-urban poverty, and as you get into the rural areas, poverty deepens.
Thank you, Prof. Dr. Apeko Enoch of the Department of Political Science, Legon, is asking you, please, at what point will we know that we are not overdoing participation and inclusion in the name of democracy?
Overdoing participation.
And
well, so we overdo participation, in my view, for instance, or we will stop overdoing participation if we also realize that when all is said and done, not everybody should be a politician, and that it should be possible to live, to work and earn a good living, an honest living, without being a politician or without getting a state job or state sinecure. I think there's a way in which political participation is now simply viewed as a way to get a government post, a way to be rewarded as a foot soldier. That is, I think, the wrong end of participation. I think I see just too much participation in partisan politics and too little participation in civic activism and in basically seeking to be good citizens and making contributions from as making our contribution as producers of the nation's wealth, because everybody wants to be a politician because that's where the rewards are loaded.
Thank you, Prof. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. We will end the webinar in the next 14 minutes. So, Prof, indulge us to respond to a few more questions. This is coming from OneNeb, West Africa, from Samasi. He's asking your perspective on what should be the new partnership between ECOWAS and AES. What should be the nature of the partnership?
This goes beyond my remit.
Exactly. But maybe a perspective that you want to share briefly, then you can take other questions.
I will take a pass on this.
Okay. Well noted, Prof. Right. Well noted. So we'll take a question also from Osman. He says, the question is where algorithm and AI can deepen polarization? How can the media use bridge to strengthen national unity? I don't know whether this is in your area, Prof. It's about social media algorithm and artificial intelligence and how we can use the media to strengthen national unity across West Africa.
You know, I'm still struggling to become literate in the use of emojis. So you can imagine this question as for algorithm is well beyond me.
Certainly, I agree with you, Prof. But we will pick this one from Kamara. He says, is proportional representation system considered to be the best for West Africa democracy?
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. But also, as I said, proportional representation also tends to produce incoherent parliamentary representation. So it has an advantage. It has an advantage in allowing and helping minority groups to get a better representation in Parliament, for instance. But it can also lead to fragmentation of parties, and fragmented parties are easy at when you have a fragmented parliament. What you also tend to have is instability at the central government level, because the government is unable to, the governing parties, it's difficult to put a governing party together. But in situations where coalition is so important to have coalition government, then proportional representation is much better, because it basically works against the overdominance of one political party and promotes a bit more consultation and consensus building. So in that sense, yes, if you stand the danger of polarization and disunity, yes, proportional representation on the whole is better. It's a better way to promote coalition building, consensus building, and over-dominant parties.
Right, thank you, Prof. This is a comment coming from Ibrahim. He did more of a contribution that in Saharan countries, such as Niger, where he is living, journalists and civil society actors have become the most fervent defenders of military regime. Today, in this section, has led to losses in freedom of expression and press freedom, as well as imprisonment of journalists and other actors advocating for democracy. For Romo Lamo, congratulating you, Prof, for your brilliant presentation. With concern about increasing polarization casting its shadow over the funding of media, how much of priority should funding independent media be? And additionally, could independent media offer the perfect tool for galvanizing a more consistent culture of accountability from citizens in Ghana and West Africa? There's a question on violent extremism, maybe if you want to share perspective on that. In the increasing trend of violent extremism and terrorism in the region, is it contributing to increased polarization? If so, should we be worried?
I repeat the last question.
Is increasing trend of violent extremism and terrorism in the region contributing to increased polarization? If so, should we be more worried about it?
Oh, yes, we should be worried about it, because, yes, any kind of extremism, any kind of extreme positions do cause more polarization. And so we should be, yes, we should be worried about it. And that's, I think, the main point of this webinar to me, is that polarization is a bad thing. Whatever contributes to it is something that we should attack. It's something that we should fight against.
Prof, we'll put the last 3 questions and we'll go to Ketim. This is coming from Conte. He's greeting you and he asks, how can we reconcile the demands of internal security with press freedom and democracy, especially in the military transition that's going at the Sahel belt. Issue about internal security versus military and press freedom and security.
Let me line up how the two. So internal security.
Yes.
Internal security.
Yes, and press freedom.
Internal security and press freedom.
And relationship with the military regime in the Sahel region.
Okay, so I take it that the quest for internal security is part of what the military regimes. This is their justification. Their raison d'etre is that they are there and they found it necessary to intervene so that internal security can be promoted. And their very presence and their methods tend to be antithetical to press freedom, right? So, so I guess the question is asking me to find a way to resolve this tension between the need for security, for national and community security, and then the need for freedom. Is that the question?
Yes, please.
You're sure? You want
to
the
need for freedom. Yeah, the need for civic to enhance the civic space, to improve media freedom and freedom of expression in the context of military regime and the repercussion that is we are faced with in the Sahel region out of dictatorship.
The problem with military regimes and with also any form of authoritarian regime is that they do see any kind of freedom as problematic. They see freedom as problematic. They see that as they see individual freedom, press freedom, civil liberties, human rights. All of these are seen as impediments in the way of national security. I always want us to go back to the period of let's say 30, 25 years ago in West Africa. The average government was one that was authoritarian, either civilian military rule or, civilian authoritarian rule or military authoritarian rule. Either way, in the absence of press freedom, there wasn't much security or stability in the region. In actual fact, until recently, let's say if you take the period from 2000 to about 2015, or even the late 90s to about the late 2010s, there was far more peace and stability and security in West African nations than there is today when democracy is struggling. So I'm not too sure that at least how military rulers see the world is the way I see the world. And I'm not sure empirically and historically whether they have a point. And at any rate, in the 2-3 years that these regimes have been around, is there more internal security in those countries or less? So the idea that you are taking away people's freedoms and you are curbing, you are introducing censorship and repressing journalists and so on, the idea that that will make the country more secure, that will bring more internal security, there's no empirical proof of that. That hasn't happened yet. It's only a hope. It's only a claim. And so from that standpoint, I think I'm totally dismissive of military rule as an answer to anybody's internal security problems, because historically that wasn't true. And in the contemporary times, at best, it's a draw.
Right. Thank you, Prof. We have the last two questions, and then we'll close. The first one is, how far and to what extent is democracy anchored on African history? This is coming from Omar.
Too big a question. Oh, African history is a very big, deep well of developments, of interactions, of experiences. And so I think I tried to pull out in my presentation, I tried to pull out some traditional ideas and practices that are pro-democratic, that are consistent with democratic values and ethos. And I think we can deliberately, we can intentionally draw on those. But we do so if we believe that democracy is what we want. If we want military rule, we can also draw examples from our history and our past as African societies to justify military rule. If we want, there's absolutely nothing that we want to do that we cannot pull out of our history. Because as I said, it's a very long history, it's a very deep history, it's a very big history. Me, I prefer to pick the elements of our history that support the practice and ideas of democracy. And that's what I try to do in the presentation. But, and I hope you find that persuasive rather than go and pick bad things from our history to try and practice today.
Thank you, Prof. And your last question is democracy made for Africa, or there's an African democracy to be experimented?
My counter question is Islam made for Africa? Is Christianity made for Africa? What is it that is made for Africa? The world is for all of us. You pick from this pool that you think is good for you, and you discard the others. So as I said, in the same way that I indicated, you can pick from our history things that are consistent and affirmative of democracy, democratic politics and democratic practices. And you can pick from the same history things that are consistent with military rule and authoritarianism. And you can pick things the same way democracy. If you want to draw examples from Africa, you find them. If you want to draw it from other societies, you do so. And I think that's how we should approach the challenges of our development.
Right. Thank you so much, Prof, for that.
All right. And thank you all for the opportunity.
Yes.
Thanks for the interaction. I hope you've given me some things to think about, and I hope I've been able to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. You've done more than what we expected. And as I said, I describe you as the father of modern democracy of Africa in my humble view. Ladies and gentlemen, Prof has given us the historical perspective of polarization, starting from the issue of culture and regional alignment when it comes to disparity. He laid a foundation about post-democracy and the challenges that we are faced with, the issue of Bretton Woods institution, that also foster polarization. He took us through social media and digital platform that sometimes provoke a backlash of politics and democracy. He went on to discuss the issue about the wave of democracy in the 1990s that promised inclusive governance and lived experiences of fairness, but risking becoming another arena of which polarization is further deepening. He pulled data from the 10-round Afrobarometer survey, 2024 to 2025, to reveal how ethnic polarization undermines multi-party democracy. He identified a number of issues, the identity politics and nationhood, issues about perception of unfair treatment and biases in exclusion by government, issue around political partisanship and identity, and the need to address that. The issue about multi-party democracy and how it has entrenched polarization across West Africa. He proposed some solutions for us. One is to strengthen local governance through genuine devolution of power, administrative, political, and physical decentralization. How also we can grant a meaningful autonomy to federal, state, and quasi-federal state, particularly in the case of Nigeria and those who practice federal system of governance. How do you also strengthen political parties to re-engineer broad cross-ethnic coalition through public financing, electoral incentive to demonstrate diversity in leadership? Again, he proposed how do we ensure that we have targeted social protection policy that will deal with the issue of regional diversity and equality, and also proposed that we should strengthen civic education in schools, community, and civic space. Also, we must strengthen constitutional checks and balances. And he ended with this quote, Prof, I quote, "Polarization may be an old companion of human society, weaving into our histories of identity and belongings, but if not detected, we need not allow to detect our future. A mosaic of cultures, histories, and worldview, not a case, but diversity becomes strengthened only when it is nurtured through inclusive governance and shared sense of national unity." End of quote. Ladies and gentlemen, some of you have asked for the slide. Rebecca Ekpe, the GGA Vice President, and others. We will publish this paper on our website and our social media handles. We'll host the recording on YouTube and various handles. You can always trace the material and acquaint yourself with further information that you want to engage with. This is a quarterly webinar. We'll be coming your way, God willing, in November for another set of discussions engaging the issue and how we can depolarize and strengthen democratic norms across West Africa. We thank you for making time to join us and see you again in our next edition of Countering Polarization and Democracy in West Africa. Thank you and have a good afternoon wherever you are.